Good evening, and welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance and interest to working Rhode Islanders. We hope you enjoy this evening's edition.
Hi, my name is Anna Quinn. I'm one of the researchers on Shortchanged, a study of unpaid wages in Rhode Island. Fuerza Laboral is an organization that since 2006 has been independently working to organize workers so that they're aware of their rights, so that to connect them with government agencies that are supposed to enforce the law, to connect them with lawyers who can help them recover their back wages. Right now those are sort of the major options. There's Rhode Island Legal Services, there's the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division, and then there's the State Department of Labor and Training, and then there's organizations like Fuerza Laboral that train workers to advocate for their rights and connect them with resources in order to recover their unpaid wages. We're here today to talk about what we found over a research process that was conducted over the past years. We started out with this study because we found that we lacked scientific evidence about the issue of non-payment of wages in Rhode Island, although we had a lot of anecdotal evidence as well as a lot of strong research that had been conducted in other cities that suggests that non-payment of wages is a prevalent and multi-billion-dollar issue in the U.S. economy.
Thank you everybody for being here today.
Gracias a todos por estar aquí hoy.
My name is Shirley Samayoa and I'm a member of Fuerza Laboral.
Mi nombre es Shirley Samayoa y soy un miembro de Fuerza Laboral.
Fuerza Laboral is an organization that is dedicated to protecting workers' rights.
Fuerza Laboral es una organización que protege los derechos de labor
and to ending labor law violations.
Y esperamos terminar con las violaciones de la ley de labor.
Fuerza Laboral has been in partnership with the University of Rhode Island Schmidt Labor Research Center.
Y estamos aquí para dar a conocer el estudio de labor del Labor Research Center, el centro de búsqueda.
And they have worked together to make this comprehensive study of unpaid wages in Rhode Island. Go ahead.
Y vamos a hablar de este documento que habla de el robo de salario aquí en Rhode Island.
It shows how very widespread unpaid wages is in Rhode Island.
Y habla de qué duro y qué grande es este problema de robo de salario aquí en Rhode Island.
I like the phrase unpaid wages, but it's not exactly accurate.
Me gusta la frase sin pagar el salario, pero no es la verdadera frase.
Unpaid wages is wage theft.
En verdad es robo de salario, no sin pago.
Wage theft is happening all across Rhode Island, and it is being allowed to happen because our laws are not being enforced.
Y el robo de salario pasa bastante en Rhode Island porque las leyes no están siendo puestas en forma.
This study was developed to show how it happened, who it happens to, and why.
Y este estudio habla de a quién le pasa, cómo pasa y por qué.
I am now a member of Fuerza Laboral.
Yo soy miembro ahora de Fuerza Laboral.
But I am also a former Calibri worker.
Pero también soy un ex trabajador de Calibri.
The owner of our company had suddenly locked the doors and not given us any warning that he was going to do this.
El dueño de la compañía bloqueó las puertas y nos dejó afuera y no nos dio ninguna explicación ni tampoco nos dio no nos dijo nada antes.
He gave us absolutely no warning.
Él no nos dijo nada antes.
When he closed the doors that day, he violated the Federal WARN Act law.
Cuando él hizo eso, estaba en violación de la ley federal, the WARN Act.
That law says that he had to tell his workers in advance, and he had to tell the state that they were going to have a mass layoff.
Ellos tenían que decir por ley a sus trabajadores y al Estado que iban a cerrar las puertas, pero no lo hicieron.
He deliberately broke the law, and this is happening all across Rhode Island to many companies.
Él rompió la ley deliberadamente y esto está pasando en Rhode Island en otras ocasiones.
I'm sorry, I said we got no notice. That's not exactly true.
Bueno, yo dije que no nos dieron noticia. No es realmente así.
We got a piece of paper taped to the door that said closed, sorry, good luck.
La verdad es que sí nos dieron noticia. Había un papel en la puerta ya que habían cerrado y decía está cerrado y buena suerte.
The Calibre workers didn't need good luck.
Los trabajadores no necesitaban buena suerte.
We needed help.
Nosotros necesitábamos ayuda.
We needed information.
Nosotros necesitábamos información.
And we needed our money.
Y necesitábamos también nuestro dinero.
We got nothing.
No nos dieron nada.
In order to get our money, to get our rights, we had to file a federal lawsuit.
Y para nosotros recibir nuestro dinero y nuestros derechos tuvimos que meter una demanda en corte.
We filed a federal lawsuit and demanded our rights.
Nosotros hicimos una demanda en corte federal y demandamos nuestros derechos.
It took us almost 3 years
Nos tomó 3 años
and a lot of problems,
y muchos problemas,
but we were finally able to be successful and we won our lawsuit.
pero al final ganamos y nos dieron ganamos nuestra lawsuit.
What we went through for those 3 years, no worker should ever have to go through again.
Y lo hicimos porque deseamos que ningún otro trabajador tenga que pasar por lo mismo que nosotros pasamos.
Fuerza Laboral and the Calibre workers have now introduced the Rhode Island Warnock Law.
Y los trabajadores de Calibre y Fuerza Laboral están ahora parte de la ley de Rhode Island, the WARN Act.
This law would mandate that any large company has to notify their workers.
Y esta ley demanda que los dueños avise a sus trabajadores de qué van a hacer.
They have to notify the state in advance.
Tienen que notificar al Estado en un avance.
Workers could then be better prepared and protected to go forward, to look for new jobs, and to move forward in the best manner possible.
Y así los trabajadores pueden estar preparados y arreglar su vida a como necesiten con ese problema.
Wage theft happens every day in Rhode Island.
Robo de salario pasa todos los días en Rhode Island.
It doesn't happen just to the 280 Calibre workers.
No solo le pasa a los 280 trabajadores de Calibre,
It happens to the Tim Horton workers and the Bugaboo Creek workers.
les pasó también a los trabajadores de Tim Horton o de Bugaboo.
Wage theft study has been done to show how this is happening and why it's happening and why it cannot continue to happen in Rhode Island.
Y este estudio de robo de salario está hecho para clarificar los muchos problemas de robo de salario que existen en Rhode Island.
We have several speakers here today who can help us to try to better understand exactly what wage theft is about.
Tenemos 5 personas aquí, también van a hablar de qué es lo que sucede en el robo de salario.
They are very directly involved with the many problems caused by wage theft.
Y ellos están bien envueltos con todos los problemas causados por el falto de pago de trabajadores.
So first I would like to introduce Anna Quinn, a student at Brown University who was one of the main consultants on this study. Anna?
Primero quiero introducir a Ana, que es la persona que hizo el estudio y ella es de la Universidad de Brown.
The purpose of this press conference is to present the findings of a mixed method study of non-payment of wages conducted by Fuerza Laboral with research assistance from Matthew Boda of the University of Rhode Island.
El propósito de esta conferencia de prensa es para presentarles a ustedes los resultados de este estudio de métodos mixtos del no pago de salario conducido por Fuerza Laboral con ayuda de Matthew Boda de la Universidad de Rhode Island.
We began this study 1 year ago because we lacked scientific evidence about the issue of non-payment of wages in Rhode Island, although anecdotal evidence and research conducted in other states suggested that this is a widespread and serious phenomenon.
Nosotros conducimos este estudio por un año, porque no teníamos ninguna evidencia científica que hablaba de esta búsqueda en otras, pero es sugerido que en otras ciudades también hay este mismo problema.
So I'll start by explaining our research process. We used 4 data sources to complete this project. We reviewed claims data from the Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training.
So voy a empezar a hablar un poquito de cómo fue el proceso. Nosotros usamos 4 diferentes recursos de datos para completar este proyecto. Nosotros, el primero que usamos fue los datos del Departamento de Labor de Rhode Island.
We also reviewed claims data from the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. So those are the government agencies charged with enforcing state and federal labor laws.
Y también utilizamos al Departamento de los Estados Unidos de Labor y esas fueron las 2 agencias federales y del estado que usamos como datos.
So we also interviewed 12 key stakeholders. So these are people who have professional experience with issues of non-payment of wages in Rhode Island. We also conducted focus groups with 32 workers who had experienced non-payment of wages.
También entrevistamos 12 personas que tenían interés, que son personas profesionales en este estudio acerca del problema de robo de labor o robo de pago de labor. Y también hicimos grupos enfocados, que son 32 participantes, trabajadores que han experimentado el problema del robo de salario.
Our focus group participants were a diverse group. They were Black, white, Latino, and Hispanic. They were Cape Verdean. They were men, women, young, old. They were citizens of the United States, and they were immigrants.
So, el grupo con el que trabajamos era de todo tipo, muy distinto. Habían hombres, mujeres, negros, blancos, personas latinas, hispanas, caboverdianos y de otras razas. Y algunos eran ciudadanos americanos y otros eran inmigrantes.
More than half of our participants had graduated from high school or college.
Más de la mitad de nuestros participantes se graduaron ya sea de escuela alta o de la universidad.
We analyzed this data to find common themes. We were careful to gather enough information from participants in order to understand which labor laws would apply to their case.
So, investigamos a todos ellos en ciertos puntos distintos y la información de ellos fue entendida a ver si los problemas de labor aplicaba en su caso.
So what we found was that non-payment of wages is taking place across a number of industries in Rhode Island, but is especially common in restaurants, construction, healthcare, manufacturing, and retail.
Nosotros encontramos que este problema de falta de pago de las personas de servicio puede suceder en muchas distintas clases de industria en Rhode Island, pero específicamente es muy común en restaurantes, en la construcción, en servicios de cuidado médico, en servicios de manufacturing o de trabajo manual y en retail o venta de productos.
In the majority of cases, workers were simply not paid for all of their hours worked.
En muchos de estos casos, los trabajadores no se les pagó por su trabajo.
Data from the Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training indicates that nearly 84% of non-payment claims received since 2002 involve a complaint of unpaid wages or salary.
Con lo que recaudamos de los datos del Departamento de Labor de Rhode Island, indica que por lo menos un 84% de falta de pago de estas pidiendo la falta de pago para ellos, no fue pagado de regreso a ellos desde el 2002.
Other common issues are unpaid vacation pay, problems with overtime pay, the practice of shorting hours or not paying for all hours worked is common in low-wage industries in Rhode Island.
Uno de los problemas de pago más grande es falta de pago de vacación, el problema de pago del tiempo extra y la práctica de cortar las horas o de no pagar por todas las horas enteras trabajadas.
We found that since 2002, the U.S. Department of Labor has awarded approximately $3.2 million in back wages in Rhode Island.
Nosotros sabemos y encontramos en el estudio que el Departamento de Labor de los Estados Unidos desde el 2002 aproximadamente ha dejado que 3.2 millones no sea recaudado de pago de salario.
One of the striking things that we found was that even in cases of non-payment deemed legitimate by the Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training, many workers still did not receive the full amount owed.
A pesar de que nosotros encontramos que había muchos casos de no pago que debería de haber recibido un pago por medio del Departamento de Trabajo de Rhode Island, muchos de los trabajadores no recibieron todo su pago completo.
Of the $1.7 million that the DLT determined was legitimately owed in unpaid wages since 2002, less than $500,000 has been recovered.
Del 1.7 millones que el Departamento de Labor ha determinado que era legítimo no pagado o robado desde el 2002, solamente menos del medio millón de dólares ha sido colectado.
This leaves $1.2 million in legitimately owed wages that has not been recovered, which is to say nothing of the cases that go unreported.
Esto quiere decir que 1.2 millones de este dinero no han sido recuperados y no van a ser recuperados. Y esto no es hablando de las cosas que no han sido reportadas.
This highlights two takeaways. The first is that enforcement matters. Over the past 10 years, inconsistent enforcement efforts, notably the Office of the Attorney General's practice of not pursuing cases of non-payment of wages under $1,500 has added up to $1.2 million that Rhode Island families are legally owed.
Esto quiere decir que si los legisladores no están tomando acción, como el Departamento del General no sigue estos casos de no pago, está más o menos agregando a este 1.500 hasta 1.2 millones que se está siendo robado de las familias de Rhode Island.
The second takeaway is that this issue of non-payment of wages is much more complicated and more common than official statistics suggest.
Eso quiere decir que esto es un problema más complicado que lo que se puede enseñar en las estadísticas sugeridas.
Our findings suggest that Rhode Islanders should be concerned with the problem of unpaid wages. Not getting paid for their work has profound consequences for workers and undermines the basic principle of our economy and our community.
Lo que nosotros encontramos que en Rhode Island, las personas de Rhode Island deben de estar con mucho conocimiento y esperando que este problema de robo de salario se arregle. No poder tener el pago por el trabajo que uno hace tiene una profunda consecuencia para los trabajadores y minimiza el trabajo básico de nuestra economía y nuestra comunidad.
However, workers and their families are not the only people affected by this issue. When workers are not paid properly, it is unlikely that these employers are paying taxes and state revenues suffer.
Además, no solo los trabajadores y sus familias son las que sufren de las consecuencias de este problema. Si las personas no están siendo pagadas, tampoco estas compañías están pagando taxes y entonces eso corta los costos de ganancia para el Estado.
The honest employers that we value so much in the state are forced to compete with businesses that cut costs by breaking the law.
Los empleadores que nosotros realmente queremos mucho porque son los trabajadores, los empleadores honestos que pagan sus tasas, están forzados a competir en una forma injusta porque están compitiendo contra estos otros empleadores que cortan los costos y rompen la ley.
As a state, we have taken a great step by passing stronger legislation to ensure that workers get paid their legally owed wages. However, this is still a pressing issue, and we must continue to pursue collaborative solutions as well as vigorously enforce the laws we already have in order to make Rhode Island a state with the economy made up of good jobs.
También nosotros sabemos que es un problema complicado y que tenemos que estar entendiendo que este es un problema que importa mucho y que tenemos que continuar tratando de buscar soluciones cooperativas que vigorosamente enfuerce la ley y que tengamos en orden en Rhode Island, en el estado de Rhode Island, una economía que es para buenos trabajos.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Is this a correct spelling of your name?
Yes.
And what county from?
I used to live in the office, now
Where?
Thank you, Anna. Next, I'd like to introduce Patrick Pierce. He can tell you about his own personal story of wage theft and the problems he's had to get labor law enforced in Rhode Island.
Ahora voy a introducir a Patrick Pierce, que él nos va a contar su historia de lo que a él le pasó en este tema.
I'm going to have to adjust this. Good evening, everybody. How are you guys doing this evening? Everybody's doing good? Good? Okay, my name is Patrick Pierce. I filed a complaint with the Department of Labor for non-payment of wages. Before, I worked for United Flooring Contractors. I had applied for that position through Craigslist as a sheetrock hanger, and I was hired by Mr. Hogan. I worked for a total of 2.5 weeks, usually 10-hour days for a total of 130 hours.
You can finish it now.
All right. I called Mr. Hogan to complain about my check. I wanted my check. Was not given my check. I was given the runaround. Instead of giving my check, I was given the runaround. He didn't want to pay me. I filed a complaint for non-payment of wages with the DLT. It took almost 1 year. 1 year. I filed the complaint March 6, 2012. A decision was rendered January 2nd, 2013. That's almost a year to get paid. The company still failed to pay me after I won the suit. They still failed to pay. The DOT communicated with the Attorney General's office regarding the enforcement. Their office informed me that they will only pursue cases that exceed $1,500. Now, I still have not received any payment of wages from my former employee. It's not fair. I represent 10 plus people at the same job site where I worked at in construction that did not file. I was the only one out of 10 people that filed and continued through the whole entire process. All I want is my money. You know, I want to get paid. I worked hard for it. I want my money. You know, it's not fair. All I want is the Attorney General, Mr. Peter Kilpatrick or Kilmartin, to do his job, you know. In a state where 90% of the people live paycheck to paycheck, he's telling me, he's telling you, he's telling your paycheck is not enough for him to go after. He's one of those 100,000 a year guys. You know, he makes 100,000, actually 115,000 a year. My $800 paycheck, my $1,000 paycheck, your $1,000 paycheck, your $800 paycheck, your $50 paycheck. He should go after it. He should do his job. He should go after it. You know, that's all I have to say.
Voy a hacer tal vez más corto. Mi nombre es Patrick Pierce y yo puse una queja al Departamento de Labor de que no me pagaron mi trabajo. Antes yo trabajaba en la compañía llamada United flooring contractors. Yo apliqué en esa posición por medio de la lista Craigslist y yo soy una persona que hace construcción y que pone plataformas de sheetrock y ese fue el trabajo que me contrataron. A mí me entrevistaron y me contrató el señor Hogan. Trabajé 2 semanas y media, como 10 horas al día, un total de 130 horas. Cuando yo llamé a Mr. Hogan para pedir mi pago, él no me contestó. Yo entendí que él era un empleador corrupto. Él no me pagó. Entonces yo fui y hice la queja de falta de pago al Departamento de Labor. Después de un año, yo puse esta queja en marzo 6 del 2012 y la decisión fue entregada un año después, en enero 2 de este año. Y el pago que se me debía era de $812.50. Entonces, me dijeron en la corte que yo no podía hacer, que ellos no podían hacer nada por mí porque la corte solo recogía dinero que fuera más de $1,500. Ahora no voy a recibir mi pago. Esto no es justo. Yo represento más de 10 trabajadores que están en la misma situación que yo, pero no tuvieron las ganas de hacer la queja como yo. Y esto es ridículo. Ese es mi dinero y yo necesito. Estoy aquí para que ustedes le pidan al Attorney General que por favor haga su trabajo. Él gana $115,000 al año y no quiere recuperar mi trabajo, que son $800. Por favor, hagamos algo.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next, I'd like to introduce George Nee, the Rhode Island president of the AFL-CIO, who can talk to us about the many problems to enforce our labor laws. George?
Do you want to talk and then make
Yeah, you can do a synopsis of it, because I don't have any, let's see how we do this. Very proud to be here with our brothers and sisters from Fuerza Laboral to support this very important issue. We're joined here today by representatives from the Firefighters Union, the Police Union, Council 94, the UFCW, SEIU, the Transit Workers Union, the Building Trades, and some other unions. So this is a statement on behalf of the labor movement that we are here in support of this issue. Maureen Martin, our Secretary-Treasurer, just said to me earlier, isn't it crazy and stupid that we have to be here talking about getting money for people who worked and have earned that money? This is crazy in 2013. I'm going to paraphrase one of the great old labor singers, Woody Guthrie. He said, sometimes people rob you with a gun, and other times people rob you with a fountain pen. This is a situation where workers are being robbed on a daily basis in our state by employers with their fountain pens. Now think of this scenario. You walk into work and the employer steals your wallet. That's a criminal offense. They would go to jail for that. The same way if you stole the employer's wallet. But in our state, if they cheat you out of your wages, whether it's Sunday work, overtime, misclassifying workers by calling them independent contractors, not paying the prevailing wage, that's okay. That's an administrative violation, and as Patrick says, it can take over a year before you find out whether you're even going to get paid. This is really an injustice, and it's an inequitable way to treat people. This is a fairness issue and an equity issue, both for the workers who are being cheated, for the good employers who pay their workers for the wage, for the hours that they work and pay them on time, and also for the taxpayers. The taxpayers of Rhode Island are also being robbed because these workers are not getting their fair wages. They're being misclassified. They're not paying into the tax system. So we have a situation where we need more support from the Department of Labor and Training and the Attorney General's office. They're doing a very good job. They're doing the best they can. They do not have the resources. We have to toughen the laws. We have to make sure they have the proper number of people to do these enforcements, and we should be treating this as the crime that it is. They are stealing workers' money, and they have an obligation to be prosecuted and have that money get back to the worker as soon as possible. Again, we are committed to this fight, and we're going to make sure that every time a worker goes to work for that hour, they get paid for that hour in a timely fashion. Thank you.
Last time we looked at the Red Scare, the witch hunt led by Joseph McCarthy against labor in the late 1940s as the Cold War expanded. But by 1955, I think everyone figured that there weren't any leftists and not too many liberals left in the labor movement at all. McCarthy, who left the political scene, had done his dirty work, and he had done a good job as far as his own perspective went. But as we look at the mid-1950s, the labor movement is nothing if it isn't resilient. It can take a tough situation, bad times, and over a period, turn it around. They're not there to suck their thumbs and feel bad for themselves. And so by the 1950s, you had the development, a very unusual development, but very important. The labor movement was able to take wages out of competition. And what I mean by that, they created master contracts. So let's say the Teamsters had a truck driver in New York, and they had a truck driver in LA, and they had a truck driver in Podunk. All of them got the same wages because they had a master national agreement. And you can imagine, while those at the either ends of the country got the same, and they were in high cost of living areas, the people in the middle were ecstatic that they were able to make better money than usual. And the 1950s, which of course was a fairly good time in the American economy, we discover that labor finally gets its due. There's a cornucopia, or a horn of plenty, of things that come down the line which our grandparents could have only dreamed about. Decent wages, fringe benefits for the first time. And what are they? Health care. Some of the best things that money can buy, and of course that's under attack as we speak now. Paid vacations, holidays off. In 1950, General Motors offered the United Automobile Workers a cost of living. It didn't come from the union, it came from management. And there were, of course, federal benefits, whether it was Social Security, Medicare, a whole host of other things that eventually would be passed in the 50s and in the 1960s. But let's not kid ourselves. For most people coming back from World War II, men and women, life was still a struggle. And the ones who did real well, who graduated from the working class to the lower middle class, and boy, that was a big jump. It usually meant that their spouses, both dad and mom, had to work, and therefore they made ends meet. And furthermore, if they had a union card in their billfold or in their pocketbook, they now could go to the suburbs and lead the good life. They went to Garden City, they went to Warwick, they went to Cumberland, they went to a lot of different places. And they found the American dream. And so the 1950s, by and large, for labor, it was a pretty good time, despite what had gone on earlier. Now, in 1952, a couple of events also happened which will change the face of labor forever. Bill Green, who had taken over from Sam Gompers in 1924, died in 1952. A few weeks later, the head of the CIO, Phil Murray, a great labor leader. I don't think very much of Bill Green, but Phil Murray was somebody. He dies a couple of weeks later. So here you have the two heads of the largest labor concerns in the United States passing on. They were intractable foes of one another, as the AFL was with the CIO in general. In 1955, 3 years later it took them, the AFL and the CIO were reunited. It's AFL-CIO even to this day. The House of Labor had been put back together. And with it, they represented, and boy, this is hard to believe in today's world, where so many things have changed. They represented at its height, maybe in the 1960 through 70, somewhere in that era, 35% of all working people in America. 35%! And I say that as a time today when it's down to about 10%. I can hear some people cheering because they like that, but let me tell you, whatever way labor goes, America goes with it. And so no one should feel any great happiness about that at all. And as I said, things got better. 1954, 1955, the minimum wage, it was a living minimum wage, hit $1 an hour. Can you imagine that? 1954, 55, a minimum wage of $1 an hour, and you could live on it with one spouse working. It was tied to the factory wage schedule as well. Amazingly, if you, in a day today where all we ever do is talk about taxes, after the war and down into the 1950s, if you made over $300,000, which of course made you a millionaire in today's money, if you earned over $300,000, your tax bill for every dollar over $300,000 was over 90%. That's right, this is not a mistake. Over 90%. And today we see people of tremendous wealth and corporations with great profits moaning and groaning about whatever they have to pay today. It's not much compared to just what they were paying yesterday. Another thing that happened in this mid-50s era, and boy, the mid-1950s are a very important period in American history, as we'll see. For the first time in American history, for the first time, more people were employed in the service sector than in manufacturing. More people were doing services than creating products. The funny thing was, nobody noticed because the economy was booming along. And we see in the 50s, and particularly in the 60s and 70s, more and more two-wage earner families. Now, part of the problem with this is later on, they're not doing it because they want to do it. They have to do it. Because to create the camouflage that the cost of living and other problems were developing in America, two people had to work in order to bring a family up. And of course, today, the number of two-spouse families working is astronomical. So, but this all began back in the 50s. It was more of a voluntary thing than it was where people really had to do it. And we see the advent, not that it hadn't been there before, it had gone back to Henry Ford's assembly line, but by 1955, 2 production workers on an assembly line could make 1,000 radios for automobiles in a day. Could make 1,000 automobiles in a day by 2 people, compared to a generation earlier when it took 200 workers to make those 1,000 radios. You can see the problems that automation is going to cause because people are in many ways losing out. Now, because things were going well, in the labor movement there was a certain degree of complacency. We had seen the ethnic cleansing. The radicals have been tossed out. The people who were left were more mainstream, if maybe I'm being too kind there, but it developed what they call tuxedo unionism, that some of the big shots in the labor movement at the national level were invited to all types of political events, and you couldn't tell the difference You couldn't tell who was from labor and who was from management because they all looked the same. An amazing thing when you think about that. I also don't want to forget, I mentioned earlier about the Red Scare. This is a pamphlet called Red Infiltration of Labor Unions by none other than John Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. And of course, he kept records on John Kennedy and Martin Luther King and a lot of other great patriotic Americans. So, and he's a controversial figure himself today, even in history. And by the way, when the troops did come home, we'll see that management tried to work out settlements so that there wasn't any labor strife, at least when the GIs finally got settled. And here we have at the Carnegie Illinois Steel Corporation a way to reinstate the GIs who came back into their former jobs. So all of this was very well planned. And also in the 1950s, as we turn to the service sector, we see that there are more and more women in the workforce because they are trained to do paperwork. And paperwork will increase geometrically from the 1950s, of course, right down through today, where we have the computers which either save us time or don't. I'll leave that up to you. But here we have a lot of office romances as we get to the service sector. And here we have the office straw boss all plying for the attention of the very attractive secretary. So it was an unusual time indeed as the world turned around us. But the labor movement eventually changed as the world around us changed. More and more people of color came into our ranks. And so today, there are probably more minorities in labor as a percentage of who we are than there is in the general population. Also, the number of women in the labor movement today is very similar to about half of what there is in the general population. And the number of people with college educations is very high. The old stereotype of the labor movement is going away fast, but we're trying to hang on to everything we have until times are a little bit better. It was President Kennedy in the early 60s when he was first elected who allowed federal employees to join a union. And of course, that changed many things as well. And in 1956, that famous period there, 1955 to 56, George Meany was elected the head of the AFL-CIO, the Combined House of Labor. He would be the first one to be in that position. He had been a plumber, the head of the New York State Federation of Labor, and he went to the National Association of Manufacturers, labor's enemy, going back to the 19th century practically. And he said to them at their convention in words which a lot of labor people never understood. He said, "I never went on strike in my life and never ordered anyone else to run a strike in my life. Never had anything to do with a picket line. In the final analysis, there is not a great difference between the things I stand for and the things that the National Association of Manufacturers stand for. I stand for the profit system. I believe in the profit system. I believe it's a wonderful incentive. I believe in the free enterprise system completely." Not that there was anything wrong with saying that, but labor knew the price of staying ahead of the game was eternal vigilance, not capitulation to the other side. But George Meany saw it a different way, and so did most of labor at that time. We saw in 1959 that there had been some corruption and criminal activity that had seeped into the labor movement. There was a famous Landrum-Griffith Act in 1958, which ended up with the AFL expelling a couple of its major affiliates because of criminal activity. And labor didn't want to admit this, but it was there, and I think it made the labor movement look good that at least they were willing to take care of those problems. Sadly, by the 1960s and 70s, a certain degree of alienation had seeped into organized labor. People on the assembly line were not the same as their parents and grandparents. They weren't willing to take the monotony, the never-ending assembly line that never seemed to stop. If anything, it always seemed to go faster. And so by the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, people were beginning to turn their back on that type of work. And that was part of the reason that some of this very high-paying jobs went south of the border, to Southeast Asia, and eventually now to southern China. And I'll show you the great anthem here of the 70s and 80s by Johnny Paycheck. Famous song, I think went to #1, "Take This Job and Shove It." And this was the feeling of a lot of people who had come out of the Vietnam War, some of the people of color who had gotten into the labor movement for the first time, and college students who weren't able to get jobs elsewhere and tried to revive a more militant labor movement in order to keep it moving ahead. Other things happened, of course, along the way. The Occupational Safety, Health and Administration, brought to us by Richard Nixon, of all people. How unusual. We saw the labor movement turn on one of its own in the 1972 election when the labor movement refused to endorse George McGovern because of his stand on Vietnam, despite the fact that he had a stellar labor record. Boy, this really created a split in the labor movement, as did the civil rights and women's movement, which eventually, as I said, turned things around. But it didn't happen overnight, and not everybody in the labor movement was for it, although I think you would find today things are very different indeed. In the 1970s, a new force came ahead, led by a guy named Ray Rogers, which he called for corporate campaigns. We saw this at Brown and Sharp. We saw this at Gorham's. We saw it at a lot of the old industrial wonders of the world in Rhode Island. Places that have been here going back to Slater's Mill time in the early 1800s. They were now at the end of their rope. And the work is held on, trying to keep them here, but oftentimes finding themselves engaged in tremendous struggle over what to do about the problems that they faced. And one by one, the major industries in Rhode Island, which had been worldwide famous, finally left the state. And with just a couple of exceptions. The textile industry has basically ended, and a lot of those places like Gorham's and Brown and Sharp are somewhere, someplace, but in name only. They were no longer here. In 1978, as we get down to the final end here, we discover that there's a Democratic president with Jimmy Carter. There's a Democratic Congress, both in the Senate and in the House. And the labor movement in 1978 offers forth a very milquetoast change in the National Labor Relations Act, which would have made it a little bit easier to organize people. And unbelievably, the Democrats turned their back on labor, and those rather tepid changes never occurred, which caused a great deal of consternation within the labor movement and the Democratic Party. George Meany, in fact, who is still alive, said about Congress's vote, "Were they seeking to destroy a labor movement that has always supported and promoted free enterprise?" Surprise, George, they were. They were. And the labor movement no longer had its strongest ally. And Lane Kirkland, who would take over from George Meany upon his death just a few years later, would have this to say about labor reform. Unlike employers in many other countries, American management has not been under attack by any hostile ideology promoted by labor. Workers and their unions have not clamored for the nationalization of industry or for chairs and votes in the corporate boardroom. We have not launched hate campaigns or organized filibusters in order to thwart the legislative process and crush legitimate rights and reasonable hopes for fair play where management is concerned. Wow, that's a real stinging indictment. Labor had put up the white flag. Forces of international enterprise with runaway shops, with a global economy, with profit margins that were becoming very thin, with environmental regulations here in America, and then, of course, what we've all seen in the last couple of years during the Great Recession, where our mortgages, and people often forget this, where our mortgages were sold by Wall Street, not Main Street, in corporate boardrooms, not union boardrooms. Our livelihoods, our economy, were nickel and dimed in third world countries. And that created the Great Recession. And people forget that. They're always too willing to point the finger at labor and say, oh, it's your fault. To the contrary. I never remember anyone being pulled out of a boardroom on Wall Street that had a union T-shirt on the way that I do. I don't remember any of them moving along with their Esplanades, their Cadillacs, and their Lexus automobiles with a bumper sticker say, Union Yes, on the background. And I don't remember Bernie Madoff being hauled off to jail with a union pin in his lapel. And yet we're always too willing, way too willing, to point our finger at the usual suspects: labor, people of color, women, immigrants, this one and that one. But we never seem to put the finger on those that are responsible. And so what's happened is that the media, Congress, the financial know-it-alls on Wall Street have pushed the controversy from their backyard down to ours. And now we look across the street and say, look at that state worker. Look at that police officer. Look at that firefighter. Look at that municipal employee. Look at that teacher. Oh, they've got it way too good. Way too good. Let's drag them down, and we'll drag ourselves with them. Because America, which was once about a race to the top, where the labor movement was the high tide that raised all boats, now we see the people throwing over the anchors as we all go seemingly down the drain. And so as the labor movement diminishes, as our numbers continue to deteriorate, yeah, there are people out there clapping, and some of them are clapping with just one hand, because they know that the middle class was a creation of the labor movement. That higher education for our kids today and its expansion can be laid at the doorstep of the labor movement. That some of our greatest social programs ever, which are now under attack, were supported, endorsed, and sustained by organized labor, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, or a host of other things that have made America great. And so if we lose the labor movement, we will lose the middle class, and we will lose America. And so for those of you who've been kind enough to stick with us all these weeks, listening to me rant and rave sometimes, and other times try to whisper a little bit, to let you know the real story of American working people. I hope you'll take from that certain lessons, that we need to stick together, that our differences are far fewer than those things we have in common, that there's nothing wrong with a landscaper supporting a school teacher or a URI professor being on a picket line helping machinists. That once upon a time, solidarity reigned supreme in America, where people stuck up for each other, and now they don't. And let me leave you with this last story. Many years ago, back when I had a paper route, it seems I've worked all my life, although that was not a union job. Every other job I had after that, once I reached about 16, has been a union job. And doing my paper route, I passed by Mr. Johnson's house, one of my customers on the paper route. And he was working in his garage one nice summer day, had the door open. And I said, Mr. Johnson, what are you doing? And I had been good friends with him. He said, Scott, well, I'm taking these nails out of these old boards. I said, what are you doing that for, Mr. Johnson? He said, well, I take the nails out and then I take my hammer and I make them straight. And then I use them again. I said, but why do you do that? Why don't you just go down to the hardware and buy a bag of brand new nails, Mr. Johnson? And he gave me that look that so many adults always give kids a look when they ask a question that's not going to be answered very easily. So he said to me, you may not understand this now, but I hope someday when you come by this house when you're older, that you'll remember what I said and that you'll understand it then. He said, my generation went through the Great Depression, and we suffered. And if we needed things, whether it was food, whether it was pieces of machinery, whether it was wood or nails, we got it in our backyard, in our garage, in our cellars, in our attics, anywhere we could. We used and reused those things that we needed. And so I take these nails out today, Scott, because I'm afraid. I'm afraid after the Great Depression and after World War II that the wolf is still waiting somewhere to come to our door. And he said, in many ways, as you know, I belong to a union, and the unions kept the wolf from our door. But I always fear the day, and I fear the day for you and my children, that you'll forget about that. So if you ever drive by here, Scott, many years later, and I might not even be here, remember what I said. And you know something, Mr. Johnson? I drove by your house many times in subsequent years, and you weren't there. But I remembered what you said, and I've never forgotten. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen 3 times each week, Tuesdays at 7 p.m., Thursdays at 8 p.m., and Saturdays at 5 p.m.